Semper everyone, and welcome back to another infield training video. Now, on a previous video that you'll have to find maybe a little bit by some minor digging, I mentioned about this newer production trench combat shotgun. Before World War I even started, there was a desire to use shotguns in combat for some close quarter battle. Now, something to take into consideration. Previous wars, whether here in the United States or over in Europe, and even in the Far East, often were fought on these open battlefields. So many times the engagements, whether close or at a distance, were shoulder-to-shoulder fighting. Now, very quickly that became an issue with World War I because of issues with mortar and artillery fire, as well as small arms fire, like more accurate rifle barrels on these rifles, as well as some sniper scopes to some degree, but also the issue of machine gun fire. So these previous battles that were fought open became very dangerous, even more so dangerous in some ways than some of those previous battles. And that's why World War I itself proved to be an entirely different type of warfare. For the United States Marine Corps, this was a huge change as well, because up until World War I, their primary fighting means was protecting naval ships. So many of these young and old Marines were as a means to just protect the naval ships and even board other enemy ships. So it was kind of much like fighting pirates, like in the Barbary Wars, or even back in the American Revolutionary Wars, where you would have these small amphibious landings, quick, hard fighting, and then back onto the boats, and back onto the ships, and move on to a different island or port. Now, during World War I, the Europeans decided, hey, we're going to do these massive land battles like we always have. And with the introduction of the United States military into the war, they wanted to just basically take these young, strong fighting troops who were inexperienced and just throw them into the mill. Luckily enough, with some high U.S. military command, we managed to convince the Brits and the French both to give us some infield training behind the lines, and then with a little bit of extra intelligence, we also managed to use our own commanders to lead our own men into battle. And that was an issue in itself, because the United States Marine Corps, being such a small unit, wasn't highly respected by U.S. Army Command. And General Blackjack Pershing himself didn't really see the Marines as anything different than your typical Army soldier. And he didn't really like the idea that the Marine Corps would actually end up fighting in Europe and possibly taking away some of the glory on the battlefield from the United States Army, which was a much larger fighting force. Therefore, the United States Marine Corps would actually fall under Army Command. And that would prove an issue because the leading Marine Corps battalion commanders outranked their divisional commanders in both the 2nd and 3rd Infantry Divisions, in which they fell under command. Now, the Marines being the way that they are, they decided to prove their mettle. So one of the ways in which they did that was with these trench shotguns. This style itself, which I'm showing to every one of my viewers in a safe, professional environment by a prior active duty infantry Marine. So please do not take down this video. This is for historical and educational purposes. These trench shotguns were a slight improvement on previous late 1890s shotguns that the U.S. military also had it. But this Mossberg 590 retro gauge is a new manufacture similar to the later model M1910 Remington or the Winchester shotguns. Nice feature with even these newer models is that you can attach the previously current issue Ontario Knife Company bayonet that the Marine Corps issued for quite some time, just like the similar earlier models that you could put, whether the World War I style, World War II, or even during Vietnam, those later M7 and then even later M9 bayonets. Another thing here that's nice is I've managed to use a reproduction original style leather sling with a little bit of modification thanks to Magpul, as well as put a reinforced double swivel on the bottom take out this rubber belt pad that came, because when you start firing this baby in on the range, really kind of takes a kick into the shoulder. But me being a jarhead that I am, I sure do love a nice heavy firing 12 gauge shotgun. This heat shield, contrary to some popular belief by those less informed on the purpose of this, was a means to allow a simple cooling air system for this shotgun, because with this long tube here, you could actually hold 9 2 5/8 or even 2 3/4 shotgun shells, whether the paper or the later brass style, or I'm sorry, the paper or the brass style, that will be used both for successful and less successful uses in World War I as well as World War II. Now, unfortunately, this model here does not have the popular glitch with the slam fire. What that meant is when these Marines would utilize this in battle, they could actually fire the round, pump back the pump itself with this foreguard, pull it back forward while still holding onto the trigger, and that would slam forward, and then the primer will be struck by the firing pin, igniting that explosive black powder or later smokeless powder, and then firing the shotgun. So you could just simply crank this bad boy back and forth without even removing your trigger, in a much faster and funner way to do things. And I know that's not a real word, but it's interesting to say it that way because, well, I'm a jarhead, so who cares? Now, the other nice thing about this, being that it was very durable, it also proved a lot of success, whether in those close quarter trench combat means of clearing around corners, as well as even in open fields when these Marines would go across these wheat fields and poppy fields into the German tree lines. Could you imagine the idea of some cornbread American Marine charging at you while under machine gun fire with fire in his eyes and the devil behind him, but God on his side, and then just pointing one of these right in your face and letting go? I can't imagine, nor would I want to, and thankfully I never had. Now, I hope everybody enjoyed this, maybe even learned something. And again, I want everyone to understand that these are just primarily for historical as well as educational tools. They're not necessarily meant for any means for people to get politically upset, because this is just how our wars were fought. And I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Stay tuned for perhaps a few more. Maybe I'll get back to more of this kit and some of the other means that these Marines fought in combat. As always, stay safe, stay salty, semper fi, and carry on.